What's happening, people? Back with another reaction, back with a track that I have heard very recently in a Buck Rogers episode, which is to say, I've been doing a watch-along series for the first season of the television show Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, and ultimately shout out to Han Solo for that. He has shared that and much else. And he mentioned that when I got to the episode Space Rockers, the 19th in the series, or in the first season of the series, that there was a music track that he'd be interested for me to do a reaction to. And as I figured very early on, meaning right at the beginning of the episode, it's a tune that plays a very significant role in the episode, and I won't spoil it if you are interested and are not aware of my Buck Rogers watch-along or haven't seen the episodes yet. I won't spoil it. But yes, it's a tune that in the 1980s surely had a futuristic style sound, though in the context of the show, the main character Buck Rogers suggests that it has an old 20th century type of feel to it, a rock and roll feel. I would argue it's more funk than rock and roll, but it's certainly, it has guitars. It has a great bass groove, so maybe it's somewhere in between, like funk rock. But yeah, it has electronic sounds, and there's this opening, like rolling melodic riff, which I'm keen to hear again. So again, this is very recently something that I have listened to, but it was in the context of a show, and so now we'll hear it divorced of that context and just as a piece of music in its own right. It's called Odyssey Part 1, and I want to make sure I have this name right. Yeah, Johnny Harris. So that name doesn't ring any bells, but I would guess this was composed at the earliest, like late 70s, and probably more like early to middle of the 80s. But as I said, it has a very funky sound. It's got some electronic elements, but it's also got a guitar and bass groove to it. So let's give it a listen. This is Johnny Harris. The track is Odyssey Part 1. And as I said, it's utilized very effectively in an episode of Buck Rogers, Season 1, called Space Rockers. See, indeed, it really is a journey, and even though it's an instrumental, it's like you're not you're not what's the right word? Number one, I don't think it needs any lyrics. I think it's excellent as an instrumental tune, but secondarily, like sometimes instrumentals, and I say this as someone who loves techno, sometimes with an instrumental, there's a duration past which you can't, there's nothing new happening, so it makes sense to, do the outro and then it's done. But this, there's a lot of experimentation going along, there's a lot of, in fact, I think there's a fusion here of melody, rhythm, and percussion. It's like there are parts of the track where there's a particular layer serving all of those functions. It is a melody, but it's playing with rhythm and it's part of the percussion at the same time. So, yeah, whether it's the keyboards flourishing up and then back down and then back up again, or speeding up and then spreading out, or the guitar doing a lot of the same, or those clap rhythms, or the bass guitar coming in, or that like big fusion of all of those different ingredients in certain sections before it then thins out in other parts. It really just is this immersive experience without needing lyrics or vocals. So yeah, it's a really compelling tune, and definitely funky. Like there's a lot of use of dissonance, which again, as someone who very much enjoys dissonant techno, obviously dissonance is a tricky thing to use, because if you go too far, it's like unpleasant to listen to. Although even in those cases, sometimes dissonance can be an acquired taste, meaning there's maybe a synth element that the first time you hear it, it's like, ooh, that's a bit sharp, or that's a bit harsh. But then you listen to it more and more, and you kind of appreciate the function it's serving, and even the aural quality of the dissonant line itself might eventually become something your brain enjoys hearing. Again, I certainly have that experience with some techno, where the first time I heard it, it's like, whew, that's a bit wicked. And then you hear it some more, it's like, oh, it is wicked, and I very much like that. And I think here, again, there's some of the keyboard work and even some of the guitar work where it's like pushing the boundaries of intensity, and it's, sliding and bending and getting very bunched up. But the more it goes on, the more I'm just there for the ride. So it is absolutely an Odyssey, and it is a very dynamic use of electronic sounds, like traditional instrument sounds, as well as, like a clap, which is not so much an instrument and, is a part of like a percussion kit on a drum machine, but is a natural, like organic element that, relates to humans' rhythmic and music making abilities that predate any keyboard or even presumably any instruments. So I like the way it fuses all that together. Again, I would classify this as funk more than anything else, but it does have some rock and guitar along the way, and it's certainly like a tune you could dance to, which watch the episode Space Rockers and you'll see a lot of people dancing to it. Not only folks in these fancy costumes with blinking lights who are performing the piece, and they're known as Andromeda, just for the record, but also people on a dance floor or on multiple dance floors, who are using these electric cords of light to engage with one or more other dancers. So yeah, it's a very energetic and dance-worthy track, quite apart from the funky sounds and the, again, frankly, very creative use of different instruments. So yeah, it's a very cool tune, and one that in the narrative of the show has an especially interesting role to play, which is central to the story of that episode. So again, I won't spoil it, but check it out. Thank you again to Mr. Solo, as well as to all those who've been taking the Buck Rogers journey, which I've mentioned before, like 80s shows especially, but late 70s and even like bleeding into the early 90s. There's just something about that era of television which, even when it's, let's say, low budget or it's a bit silly at times, there's something very nostalgic and enjoyable about shows and scenes from that era. So I've absolutely been loving it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some tables and chairs that I want to go flip over, so I'll see you next time. Peace.